Rebecca Hall, you're the writer and director of Passing, which is about a Black woman in the 1920s, as well as her childhood friend who is passing as white. The novel it's based on was written almost 100 years ago. When did you discover it, and how did it affect you and inspire you?
I discovered it 13 years ago. It was a very specific moment in my life, I think. I was talking more about my own complicated mixed race heritage, and complicated in that it was very shrouded in mystery and hidden. And although I knew snippets from my mother because she experienced incidents of racism growing up in Detroit, she's American. This is my American side. And she knew things about her father, but also didn't know things. And increasingly, I was talking about it to people, and someone around this time handed me the book and said, this thing you're talking about, the reason why it's so mysterious could be something to do with this. And honestly, I remember looking at the book and thinking, passing, what does that even mean? What is that word? But reading the book was, of course, very emotionally galvanizing, but also creatively, because yes, it gave me this context for understanding my own racial identity, for understanding my grandfather, who I now know was Black. His parents were Black. He was racialized Black, but he chose at a certain point to live his life as a white man. And with that comes a huge erasure of my family history. So yes, I had a sort of context and empathy and compassion for him with this book, but also, I don't know, honestly, it sort of gave me a framework from which to think about identity on a larger scale, because ultimately it's about how any of us negotiates how we want to be in the world. It's sort of about the tension between the person that we think we ought to be and the person, because of how society views us or whatever, or various different systems of oppression that you may or may not exist under, and the person that you want to be and how much freedom you have within that. I was struck by its modernity, and I was sort of struck by its universality, honestly. It's an extraordinary piece of fiction that is only 93 pages long, very slim, very economical. But yeah, I can only, the sort of, how it hit me was very forcefully. It was a sort of, I couldn't stop the movie in my head. So in a way, I wrote the first draft of the screenplay as a response to trying to shut off the movie in my head after reading the book. It was that sort of interaction. I wrote the first draft in about 10 days after reading it. Wasn't great. And then I stuck it in a drawer because I was slightly overwhelmed and intimidated by its potential. I was scared I couldn't actually pull it off. I had a lot of big ideas and they seemed a little scary to me. So it sat in a drawer for about 6 years. And then I got it out, tinkered with it and started showing it to people, then spent 7 years trying to get it made.
And before, this being your feature film debut as a writer director, was this something that you had always wanted to pursue before Passing, or was it really this particular story that galvanized that?
No, I'd always wanted to do it. I think when I was a kid, the people I idolized as a child weren't actors, funnily enough. I mean, I came to acting, found myself to be fairly good at it and to achieve success at it. And that was very rewarding. But when I was a kid, I my heroes were like Alfred Hitchcock and Robert Mitchum, oddly, and also it's kind of, which doesn't count, but I suppose I'm thinking about Night of the Hunter and Charles Lawton. But it was the art of filmmaking that got me into it. That's what I was interested in, and I've always wanted to do that. And I've always been a writer. I've just been a bit quiet about it.
And in this particular story, there's so much happening for these characters internally, where, as a writer, you're, trusting your actors and your audience to pick up on subtexts and emotional beats. Is that a challenging to know when to say something and when to kind of suggest something in the process of telling the story?
It's hugely challenging. It was the challenge of the book. I mean, it's sort of, I mean, the story is really focused on, you know, it's sort of purporting to be about the woman who's hiding her racial identity, but actually it's about that woman's effect on the other woman who's not hiding her racial identity, but is arguably hiding everything else about herself and is crumbling from the inside, but doesn't even know it. And so it was always the problem of the adaptation was how do you show that? I mean, yes, of course you rely on your actors, but at the same time, you've got to give them something, you've got to dramatize something for them to play with. And even the book is so economical. It asks so much of you to do the work. And I wanted the film to have that same quality. So it was a very sort of, it was a constant negotiation of balancing. You know, there were times that you could tip it too far into one interpretation, and then it would be about pulling that back. But a lot of it was also done through, you know, I thought a lot about juxtaposition and antithesis, you know, the sort of idea that you could give Irene a line about feeling safe within the context of her home, but juxtapose that with the woman sitting beside her who is following her literally around the house, and the kids playing a game of cowboys and Indians above her head with a thumping. So you have this sort of dissonance constantly. And, you know, so it was always like a sort of the visual language somehow betraying her subtext without, you know, sort of like her talking whilst in the mirror, and the sort of sense of her visual landscape being untrustworthy. So the audience is slowly let in on the idea that she might be an unreliable witness to the world that we think that we are experiencing through her, and her own sense of her own morally righteousness becomes sketchy.
And speaking of visual language, you shoot the film in black and white. Was that something that you knew from the writing stage that you wanted to do? And if so, was that, you know, how did that influence the writing process, knowing the visual style was going to be that?
Yes, the black and white and the aspect ratio, the sort of constrained putting them in a box thing were all ideas that I had 13 years ago. The black and white it did help the writing, funnily enough, to think of it like that, because I was always thinking of it as being a visual metaphor. And I suppose if your overall mission statement is an abstraction, and you're sort of asking your audience to sort of consider perception and what they see and context, which is kind of what the story's all about, then, you know, that does a lot of work for you. It also sets a sort of a tone that is expressionistic, which was very important to me as well. And it also allowed me to carry that expressionism into sound design, you know, play with the subjectivity versus objectivity all the time, always throw into question our perception. Like, what are we seeing? Is it the same? Is it static? Is our sense of someone's identity static, or is it shifting from one scene to the next?
And telling the story now in 2021, a story, you know, the novel came out in the 20s and the story is still set in the 20s. Like, did that require any, you know, major changes or evolutions to the story to kind of, you know, make a modern film about the period?
It was never my intention to make a period film, oddly. Yes, it is set in the 20s, and I think there's a certain amount of societal rigidity that comes with that I think is important for the story, but beyond those sort of social mores or whatever you want to call them, I didn't want to be beholden to making it a time capsule or sort of making it a kind of nostalgic museum piece or anything like that. And that was always a risk, given the black and white and the 4:3. You know, it was always a risk that those choices were going to look like I was making a homage to old films or something, and that's not really the intention. And I think a lot of that was countered with a a sort of delicacy around the language. I mean, yes, there are passages that are very specifically 1920s, but there are also I also took a lot of liberties. I think there was I was conscious of doing just enough, using phrases like rot and, slang words that felt very specifically period. But then you take like the sort of row scene, the pivotal big argument that happens between Irene and Brian towards the end of the movie. And that's littered with overlapping and quite a lot of modern phrases. So I was sort of a little playful with that deliberately.
Well, I want to congratulate you on the film, and thank you so much for talking to me about it. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.